I was never supposed to live an easy life, but I lived a purposeful one. Every wrinkle on my face is a line of poetry written by sacrifice, and every scar upon my hands is a memory of struggle endured for the sake of someone I loved more than life itself, my son, Daniel. When Daniel was born, the world seemed brighter. His father had already left by then, walking away before he could even hold his newborn child. I stood in that cold, sterile hospital room with a fragile infant pressed against my chest and realized that I would have to be both mother and father, protector and provider. I was only 22, with nothing but determination in my heart and a pair of borrowed shoes on my feet. The years that followed were not kind. I worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, to keep food on the table. During the day, I scrubbed floors in a hotel until my knees ached and my back throbbed. At night, I stitched clothes for neighbors and customers who paid me just enough to buy powdered milk, rice, and a second-hand toy once in a while. My hands were always red and raw, but I never complained. Every blister was a silent promise that my boy would never know the kind of hunger I had endured as a child. Daniel was my reason. I would rush home from long shifts, exhausted and sore, only to find him waiting with his school books spread across the rickety kitchen table. His eyes would light up the moment I entered, and that single smile could erase every pain in my body. I would sit with him, guiding his small fingers across the pages, teaching him how to read, how to write, how to dream bigger than the walls of our tiny apartment. I remember one winter when he was 8. Our heater had broken, and I couldn't afford to fix it. The nights were mercilessly cold, and Daniel's little body shivered under the threadbare blankets. So I stayed awake, holding him against my chest, breathing warm air onto his cheeks, whispering lullabies until he drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I went to work with chapped lips and a fever, but I told no one. A mother does not measure her sacrifices. She simply gives and gives until there is nothing left. When Daniel reached high school, things began to change. He grew taller, stronger, his voice deeper. I was proud of him, but also frightened. I worried that he would see the holes in my shoes, the cracks in our walls, and feel ashamed of me. So I worked harder, saving every penny so he could wear decent clothes, have new books, and never feel the weight of poverty pressing on his shoulders. I still remember the day of his graduation. I sat in the back row wearing a faded dress that had long lost its shine. When Daniel walked across the stage, receiving his diploma, my eyes blurred with tears. I clapped until my palms stung. That moment felt like proof that every sacrifice had been worth it. But life does not always repay what we pour into it. Daniel went to college, and though I supported him with every ounce of strength I had, the distance between us grew. He stopped writing letters, stopped calling as often. I told myself it was normal that young men chase their own paths. And yet, late at night, when I sat alone in my tiny room, I wondered if he still remembered the woman who had stitched his clothes by candlelight and skipped meals so he could eat. Even as my hair turned gray and my body weakened, I continued to work. Though by then, the jobs were scarce and my health was fading. Arthritis stiffened my hands, making every movement painful, but I endured. Because in my heart, I believed Daniel would one day look at me and say, "Mother, you are my blessing." Instead, years later, I heard the words that would shatter me. "You're a burden, Mom." But that is another chapter of this story. For now, all I can tell you is this. A mother's sacrifice is endless. It is woven into the fabric of her child's life, unseen, unacknowledged. And though the world may forget, though even the child she raised may dismiss it, she knows. She remembers every sleepless night, every hungry day, every moment she chose love over comfort. And I, Margaret Williams, remember it all. The nursing home smelled faintly of bleach and wilted flowers. It was not the kind of place where people came to live. It was where they came to wait. Wait for visits that never came, letters that were never sent, apologies that would never arrive. The halls echoed with silence, interrupted only by the slow squeak of wheelchairs or the distant hum of a television no one really watched. When Daniel first brought me here, I told myself it was temporary, a place to rest, to regain my strength, perhaps to recover from the aching arthritis in my joints. He had said the words so smoothly. "You'll be more comfortable here, Mom. You'll have people to take care of you." But beneath his practiced smile, I saw something else. Relief. As though he had just unloaded a heavy sack he no longer wished to carry. The first night, I lay awake in a narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. I could hear muffled sobs from the room next to mine. In another wing, someone was coughing, a wet, rattling sound that went on for hours. I wondered how many of us had been called burdens, how many of us had been cast aside when we became inconvenient. Mornings in the home began with the same routine, the clang of the breakfast cart, the shuffling of feet, the polite greetings of nurses who were kind but weary. They brought oatmeal and pills, set them on the bedside table, and moved on. I missed the smell of my own kitchen, the way the scent of fresh bread used to fill the air when I baked on Sundays. Here, food was fuel, not love. Still, there were small lights in the gloom. I met Edith, an 82-year-old woman with bright eyes and a laugh that belonged in another time. She had been a schoolteacher, she told me, until her children decided she was too frail to live alone. They visited once a month, bringing flowers, taking photographs for social media, and then vanishing until the next calendar reminder. Edith called them her holiday children. Then there was George, a quiet man who spent his afternoons carving birds out of scraps of wood. His hands trembled, but his creations were beautiful. Delicate wings, tiny beaks, polished smooth with patience. He told me he had once built cribs and rocking chairs for his grandchildren, but when his health failed, his family placed him here. He hadn't seen them in 3 years. We became a kind of family, the forgotten ones. In the afternoons, we gathered in the lounge, playing cards or sharing stories from the lives we once led. Some spoke of wars they survived, others of businesses they built or gardens they tended. Every tale was a reminder. We were not always frail, not always discarded. Once we had been the foundation of our families, the beating hearts of households. And yet, as the days passed, I noticed how quickly people faded when no one came for them. Their eyes dulled, their voices weakened, their bodies seemed to sink deeper into their chairs. Loneliness, I realized, was a disease more deadly than any infection. I wrote letters to Daniel, at first cheerful ones. I told him about Edith's sharp wit, about George's carvings, about the bingo games that filled the evenings. I signed every letter with love, hoping he would write back. Weeks passed, then months. His replies grew shorter until they stopped altogether. The silence was louder than any rejection. One Sunday, I sat in the garden behind the home, watching the late autumn leaves drift to the ground. Edith sat beside me, knitting with fingers that moved more from habit than strength. "Do you ever wonder if they'll regret it?" I asked her quietly. She didn't look up. "Of course they will. But by the time they realize it'll be too late." Her words settled into me like stones. That night, I walked past the hallway mirror and caught a glimpse of myself. Gray hair unkempt, shoulders stooped, eyes tired. For a moment, I almost believed Daniel was right, that I was a burden. But then I remembered the years I spent working my body to the bone so he could have more. I remembered the nights I went hungry so he wouldn't. A burden? Number. I was the very reason he had survived, thrived, lived. It was in that moment that something shifted inside me. If Daniel had decided to discard me, then I would decide how to define my own ending. I would not wither here in silence, waiting for visits that would never come. If my son had given me the name of burden, then I would give him one in return, a burden he would never forget. I did not yet know how, but I knew this. My story was not finished. Days in the nursing home blurred together like the muted colors of an old photograph. Morning bled into afternoon. Afternoon sank into evening. The television murmured in the background, and the scent of disinfectant became a kind of clock, fresh and sharp in the morning, stale and heavy by night. But inside me, something had begun to shift. It started as a flicker, an ember of anger hidden beneath layers of exhaustion and sorrow. I'd never allowed myself to feel anger toward Daniel before. Even in his teenage years, when he shouted at me for not understanding his world, I excused him. Even when he forgot my birthday the first time, I told myself he was busy. Even when he left me here with a promise to visit soon, I forgave him before the door closed. Yet one night, sitting alone in the lounge while rain lashed against the windows, I felt the ember flare. Not a wild fire of rage, but a steady, deliberate heat. The kind of heat that could forge something new. I began keeping a notebook, an old spiral-bound pad one of the nurses gave me. At first, it was just a place to pour my thoughts. Lists of memories. Daniel's first steps, his first day of school, the day I taught him how to ride a bike. But soon, the entries changed. I began writing questions. Why do children forget? Why does sacrifice turn invisible? What is owed, and what is forgiven? Writing steadied me. It turned my grief into sentences, my despair into plans. By the third week, the notebook had become more than a diary. It was a blueprint. Edith noticed the change before anyone else. "You've got that look," she said one afternoon as we sat near the window, watching a sparrow peck at crumbs on the sill. "What look?" I asked. "The look of someone who's done being sad," she said, smirking. "The look of someone about to do something." I smiled faintly but said nothing. The idea of fighting back was strange to me. I had spent my whole life enduring, bending, sacrificing. But perhaps endurance was just another cage. Perhaps my son believed I would always forgive him, always accept what he gave, or what he took away. One evening, after the staff had done their rounds, I pulled my notebook into my lap and began to write furiously. Names, dates, numbers, every sacrifice I had ever made for Daniel, every bill I paid, every shift I worked, every meal I skipped. By the time I was done, my hands trembled from arthritis and emotion. The list stretched across pages. Reading it back to myself, I felt something solidify. My life had not been small. My choices had been mighty. And if Daniel wanted to treat me as a burden, then he would have to understand the weight of what he had thrown away. I also began to listen more carefully in the home. Whispers drifted through the hallways, stories of children who abandoned their parents but hovered greedily over their wills, stories of promises broken, inheritances fought over, funeral debts left unpaid. It was the same story, over and over. We had all been the foundation stones, and now we were the rubble beneath their feet. But rubble can still cut. I visited the social worker assigned to the home, a kind but efficient woman named Carla. Under the guise of asking about my benefits, I inquired about legal options, what rights I had, what control I still held over my finances. She explained things gently, unaware of the storm forming behind my polite nods. After that, I began making phone calls. Quiet, careful phone calls. I reached out to a lawyer recommended by one of the nurses, a woman who specialized in elder rights. I asked questions about power of attorney, about wills, about transferring assets. I spoke in soft tones, but inside I felt like a general mapping a battlefield. Meanwhile, I kept up my letters to Daniel, but the tone shifted. Instead of desperate pleas for visits, they became calm and factual. "I'm doing fine," I wrote. "The home is comfortable. I'm making new friends. By the way, I'm working on some changes to my estate." I imagined his brow furrowing as he read those lines, his mind racing with assumptions. Good. Let him wonder. Let him stew. At night, when I couldn't sleep, I would picture his face when he realized that the woman he had called a burden had become a burden of a different kind, one that weighed on his conscience, his finances, and his reputation. It wasn't revenge I craved. It was balance. It was the chance to stand tall again, even if only in my own eyes. And somewhere beneath all of that, buried deep, was still a hope. A faint, flickering hope that perhaps this would wake him up, that he would remember who I was, not just an old woman in a nursing home, but the mother who had built his life from the ground up. I didn't yet know exactly how it would end. But I knew this. I would not die here forgotten. That ember inside me burned brighter, and I held it close. I have always believed that patience is a mother's greatest weapon. It takes patience to rock a child through the night, to wait for a fever to break, to save pennies until they form $1. And now, In the twilight of my life, patience became the sharpest tool I had left. If Daniel thought leaving me here was the end of the story, then he had underestimated the woman who had raised him. The first step was silence. I stopped writing letters that begged for his attention. Instead, my words grew colder, sharper, updates without warmth. The garden is pleasant. The doctor says my blood pressure is steady. I have been speaking to lawyers about my estate, just enough to keep his mind unsettled, just enough to remind him that I was still alive and thinking. The second step was record keeping. In my notebook, I began to write not only memories, but evidence. Bills I had paid for him, debts I had cleared when he was in college, the time I pawned my wedding ring to buy his textbooks. I listed every sacrifice as though preparing testimony for a trial. The pages became my arsenal. But the third step was the most delicate: creating alliances. Edith was the first. She had children of her own who kept her tucked away like an old coat in a forgotten closet. Her sharp mind and wry humor made her an invaluable confidant. Over knitting needles and weak cups of tea, I shared pieces of my plan. "You're going to give him something he won't forget," she said, eyes twinkling. "Exactly," I replied. George was the second. He had a quiet dignity, and though he didn't say much, he understood the language of injustice. One afternoon, I asked if he could carve me a small wooden box, something simple but sturdy. He didn't ask why. A week later, he handed it to me, polished and beautiful. "For your secrets," he said. Inside that box, I placed copies of letters, receipts, and my diary entries. It was more than a collection of paper. It was a story, the truth of my life, waiting to be read. I also began to meet with my lawyer more regularly. She was a sharp woman named Evelyn, who wore her hair in a tight bun and carried an air of quiet ferocity. When I explained my situation, she did not look at me with pity. She looked at me with respect. "You have every right," she told me firmly. "Your son cannot dictate your worth. And your estate, well, that is entirely yours to decide." Her words were like fresh air filling my lungs. For so long, I had believed that my life was no longer mine to shape. Now I realized it was not only mine, it was still powerful. Together we began drafting documents. My modest savings, the small house I had worked my entire life to pay off, the jewelry tucked away in a safety deposit box, all of it I redirected. Not to Daniel, not to the man who had called me a burden. Instead, I assigned it to charities for single mothers, to the nursing home staff who treated me with kindness, and to Edith and George, who had become more like family than my own son. The fourth step was planting seeds in Daniel's mind. I arranged for the social worker, Carla, to call him with updates about my legal consultations. I knew she would phrase it neutrally, but the words legal and estate were enough to strike at his imagination. True to prediction, Daniel called me one evening. His voice was tight, clipped. "Mom, what's this I hear about you making changes to your will?" I kept my tone calm. "It's nothing for you to worry about, Daniel. I just want to make sure everything is in order." "In order? You mean giving everything away to strangers?" "To people who care for me," I corrected gently. "To people who didn't call me a burden." The silence on the other end was thick. I could almost hear the wheels of his mind turning, grinding with frustration and greed. When he finally spoke, his words were softer. "Mom, I didn't mean what I said before. You know I love you, but I had heard the truth once, and truth cannot be unspoken." The fifth step was confrontation. Not yet the final one, but small tests. When Daniel visited me at last, his first visit in months, I made sure Edith and George were there, witnesses to my strength. I greeted him warmly enough, but when he asked about my health, I replied, "The nurses here take good care of me." Much better than being treated like a burden. His face darkened, but he said nothing. That silence was my victory. That night, as I returned to my room, I felt something I had not felt in years: control. I was no longer the abandoned mother sitting by the window, waiting for scraps of affection. I was the architect of a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life. The burden he had given me, loneliness, rejection, sorrow, I had reshaped into a weight that now pressed on him, and the weight would only grow heavier. For the first time since Daniel left me here, I slept peacefully. The call came on a gray Tuesday afternoon. Rain was pattering against the lounge windows, and Edith and I were playing a slow game of cards when the nurse tapped my shoulder. "Your son's on the line," she said softly. I almost laughed. Daniel never called during the week. His busy schedule, he always claimed, made it impossible. But something in the nurse's eyes told me this wasn't a casual hello. When I picked up the receiver in the hallway, Daniel's voice was strained, thinner than I remembered. "Mom," he said without preamble, "I need to talk to you about something important." I leaned against the wall, steadying my breath. "Go on." There was a pause, the sound of him inhaling sharply. "Things haven't been good. The company had layoffs and, well, I was one of them. And with the mortgage and the kids' school fees." His words trailed into a sigh. "It's been hard, Mom. Really hard." The irony wasn't lost on me. All my life, I had endured hardship so he wouldn't have to. And now, when I had nothing left to give, hardship had found him anyway. "I'm sorry to hear that, Daniel," I said evenly. He hesitated before continuing. "I know you've been talking to lawyers about your will. I don't want to sound ungrateful, but if something were to happen, you know how much of a difference your estate could make for my family." There it was, not even disguised as concern, a plea coated in self-interest. I let a moment of silence pass before answering. "Daniel, my estate will go where it is most deserved. To those who have shown me care and kindness when I needed it most." "Mom, please," he said, his voice tightening. I was under a lot of stress when I said those things before. I didn't mean them. "You know I love you, love." That word again. So easy to speak, so heavy to prove. "I'll think about it," I replied, my voice calm. "But in the meantime, I suggest you focus on your own responsibilities." The conversation ended soon after, and I returned to the lounge. Edith raised an eyebrow as I sat down. "He's worried," I told her. "Good," she said without looking up from her cards. "It's about time he carried some of the weight you've carried all your life." In the days that followed, Daniel's calls grew more frequent. He came to visit twice in a single month, a record. Each time he arrived with forced cheerfulness, carrying flowers or chocolates as though gifts could erase years of neglect. But beneath the surface I saw the cracks. His suit was less pressed, his eyes lined with exhaustion. He spoke quickly, too quickly, about opportunities, investments, things just around the corner. But the desperation in his tone betrayed him. One afternoon during his visit, I placed my wooden box on the table between us. "What's this?" he asked, frowning. "Memories," I said simply. "Everything I've done for you, Daniel. Every sacrifice. I've written it all down." He opened the lid and flipped through the papers, receipts, letters, diary entries. His jaw tightened as he skimmed the pages. "Why are you showing me this?" he asked. "Because you need to understand what you've thrown away," I said quietly. "You called me a burden. But look here, page after page. You'll see who really carried the weight." He slammed the lid shut, his cheeks flushed. "Mom, this isn't fair." I was under pressure. I didn't mean it like that. I leaned forward, my voice steady. "Fair? Life wasn't fair when I went hungry so you could eat. It wasn't fair when I worked 3 jobs so you could go to college. And it certainly wasn't fair when the son I gave everything to abandoned me in a nursing home." His eyes darted to the box, then back to me. For the first time, I saw not anger or annoyance, but shame. Real, unfiltered shame. I didn't push further. I simply sat back, folded my hands and said, "The burden you gave me, Daniel, I am giving back to you. Whether you carry it with guilt or with change, that's your choice." The next week, I met with Evelyn again. Together, we finalized the paperwork. Every asset redirected, every clause airtight. Daniel would inherit nothing, not out of cruelty, but out of justice. Instead, my estate would flow to the people and causes that reflected my life's values: resilience, kindness, sacrifice. When I signed the last document, my hand trembling from arthritis, Evelyn gave me a firm nod. "You've taken back your power," she said. I walked out of her office feeling lighter than I had in years. The burden was shifting. The next time Daniel visited, he was quieter. No flowers, no chocolates. He sat across from me with his hands clasped, his shoulders slumped. "Mom," he said finally, "I've been thinking about what you said. About the sacrifices you made. I waited. I didn't see it before. I didn't want to see it. But now, I do. And I don't know how to make it right." For a long moment I studied him. The boy I once cradled was gone, but the man sitting before me, flawed, selfish, but perhaps not beyond hope, remained. "You can start," I said slowly, "by never calling me a burden again. Not me, not anyone. Because one day, Daniel, you'll find yourself in my shoes. And when that day comes, you'll understand everything." His eyes dropped to the floor. "I already do," he whispered. But whether he truly meant it, or whether it was just another attempt to win back my favor, I couldn't yet tell. Either way, the tables had turned. The air outside my window had grown colder, the first hints of winter sneaking in. Life inside the nursing home moved on as it always did. Slow, predictable, dull. But I was no longer the same woman who had once sat quietly, resigned to invisibility. No, now I carried something new, a sharpness, a purpose. Daniel had taken the notebook with him, but I knew it wasn't just words he carried home. It was a curse. Every page he read was a weight pressing harder on his chest. Every sacrifice, every wound, every moment of loneliness I had endured became his inheritance. He would not escape it. For weeks after his visit, he returned again and again. At first with flowers, then with home-cooked food, then with promises. Always promises. "I'll take you out of here, Mom. I'll hire someone to help you at home. I'll make up for everything I've done." I listened. I nodded, but my silence spoke louder than his desperation. He wanted forgiveness, and forgiveness was the one thing I would not give freely, not yet. One night, long after the halls of the home had gone quiet, I sat at my window and thought of the word he had branded me with, burden. It had nearly destroyed me. But then I realized perhaps I could give that word back to him, not as cruelty, but as truth. Because burdens are not only weights, they are lessons, chains we must drag until we understand the cost of our choices. If he had made me one, then it was only fair that I made him mine. Daniel's unraveling began subtly. His wife, Maria, called me one afternoon, her voice tight with worry. "Your son hasn't been sleeping. He paces at night, muttering about debts, about mistakes. He barely eats. What happened between you two?" I smiled faintly into the receiver. "He's remembering," I said simply. That's all. Maria didn't understand, not fully, but she didn't press. When Daniel next visited, his face was pale, his eyes hollow. He set the notebook on my lap, his hands trembling. "I can't stop thinking about it, Mom," he confessed. "Your words, they haunt me. Every sacrifice, every hardship, I feel it now. It's crushing me." I closed the notebook gently. "Good," I whispered. His eyes widened in shock, as if expecting comfort. But I had no comfort left to give. "You wanted to call me a burden, Daniel. Now you know what a burden truly is. It isn't an old woman who needs care. It's a conscience weighted down by guilt." He lowered his head, tears staining the floor. For the first time, I felt no pity. Days bled into weeks, and the transformation grew sharper. Daniel, once the proud man in polished shoes and expensive suits, began to stumble under the invisible weight. His business suffered. He lost contracts, forgot meetings. His colleagues whispered about his distracted mind, his trembling hands. One evening, he confessed it all. "I dream of you every night," he said, his voice breaking. "I see you hungry, cold, crying in silence, and it's my fault. I wake up gasping, as if your pain is choking me." I touched his cheek, but not with love, with finality. That is your real burden, my son. And you will carry it as I carried mine. But even as I watched him unravel, I wondered, was I cruel? Or was I simply just? I remembered the day he had signed the papers, placing me here, telling me I was too much to handle. I remembered the look in his eyes, not sorrow, not hesitation, but relief. Relief at being free of me. That memory hardened my heart. No, I whispered to myself in the stillness of my room. This is not cruelty. This is justice. The true moment of reckoning came on a cold December night. Daniel arrived, his hands shaking, his eyes bloodshot. He fell to his knees before me, clutching my frail hands in his strong, broken ones. Please, Mom. Please take it back. I can't live like this. The guilt, it's destroying me. I looked at him, my son, the boy I had once carried on my hip, the man who had once called me a burden. And I realized the truth. I had finally given him something he could not escape. My sweet boy, I said, my voice steady. I don't need to take it back. Because this is what you gave me. I lived with it for years. Now it's yours. His sobs shook the room. The nurses glanced in through the glass but did not intervene. To them, it was only a son grieving beside his mother. But I knew better. I had passed the burden on, and I felt lighter than I had in years. Winter settled in fully, blanketing the world outside the nursing home in silence. Snowflakes drifted past my window like ghosts, and I wondered if they too carried burdens of their own before melting into nothing. Daniel's visits became more erratic. Some days he came with trembling hands full of flowers. Other times he appeared haggard, eyes hollow, his voice nothing more than a whisper. Guilt had made its home inside him, and it was devouring him from within. I watched carefully, weighing every gesture, every word. The burden I had given him was heavy, perhaps too heavy. But wasn't that the point? He needed to feel what it meant to be discarded, forgotten, unvalued. He needed to choke on the bitterness I had lived with. Only then could he understand. And yet, a question gnawed at me. Was I teaching him or destroying him? The answer began to take shape one evening when he arrived late, his hair wet from snow, his clothes disheveled. He fell into the chair beside my bed and buried his face in his hands. "Mom," he whispered hoarsely, "I think I'm losing everything. My business is collapsing. Maria barely speaks to me. The kids avoid me. And I can't breathe under this weight." I studied him. His voice was ragged, but beneath it was something new, humility. The arrogance, the certainty, the pride that had once defined him were gone. "Tell me, Daniel," I said softly. "Do you still think I was the burden?" His head snapped up, eyes red and wet. "No," he cried. "God, no." "You weren't the burden. I was. I was blind, selfish, ungrateful. I treated the person who gave me everything as if she was nothing. I see it now. I see it every waking moment. For a long time, neither of us spoke. His words hung in the air like incense, sharp, stinging, impossible to ignore. At last, I reached for his hand. My fingers, weak and thin, wrapped around his trembling ones. Then perhaps the burden has done its work. The following weeks brought change. Slowly, painfully, Daniel began to rebuild. He came not just with apologies, but with action. He moved me out of the nursing home and back into a small house near his own. He visited every day, not out of duty, but out of love. He brought my grandchildren, who at first were hesitant, but soon warmed to my presence. Together, we shared meals, stories, laughter, and though the guilt still lived in his eyes, it began to soften. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed into my new room, he sat beside me, his hand resting on mine. "Mom," he said quietly, "I'll carry your story for the rest of my life. Not as a punishment, but as a reminder. You weren't a burden. You were my foundation. And I'll never forget that again." Tears slid down my cheeks. For the first time in years, they were not born of sorrow, but of release. Yet part of me knew the truth. The burden would never truly leave him. It would live inside him always, whispering in quiet moments, appearing in dreams. But perhaps that was as it should be, because some lessons are too costly to forget. As I sat with my son, watching the snow outside, I realized something profound. Burdens are not always chains. Sometimes they are gifts in disguise, painful, heavy, but transformative. I had given my son a burden, yes, but I had also given him a chance to become more than the man who once abandoned his mother. Whether he rose beneath the weight or collapsed under it was no longer mine to decide. My part was done. I leaned back, closing my eyes, and for the first time in decades, I felt free. Epilogue: The Weight of Love. Years later, when I was gone, Daniel stood at my grave with his children beside him. His hair had gone gray, his face lined with time, but his eyes were steady. He placed the old notebook on my headstone, the pages weathered from years of reading. "My mother was never a burden," he said softly. "She was the reason I stand here today. And though I carry her pain, I also carry her love. Both are heavy. Both are mine." His children looked up at him, listening, learning. And in that moment, I knew, from wherever I was, that the burden I had left him had finally become something greater. Not punishment, not guilt, but legacy. The leaves had begun to fall by the time Daniel returned. Autumn sunlight streamed weakly through the windows of the nursing home, casting long shadows across the hallway floors. I knew this visit would not be like the others. He had called ahead, his voice steady but strained. "Mom, I need to see you." Alone, I prepared myself. I placed the wooden box on my nightstand, the documents neatly arranged inside. My notebook rested beside it, pages filled with every memory, every sacrifice, every truth I had carried alone for too long. This was the day my son would finally face them. When Daniel arrived, he looked older than his years. His once perfectly styled hair was graying at the temples, and the sharpness of his tailored suits had given way to something looser, more worn. He was still my son, but the confidence I once envied had been chipped away by life's blows. "Hi, Mom," he said quietly, closing the door behind him. "Hello, Daniel," I replied, my voice calm. I gestured to the chair across from me. "Sit." He obeyed, his hands fidgeting in his lap. For a long moment, we simply looked at each other, the silence thick with all the words we had never said. Finally, he cleared his throat. "I know I've made mistakes. I know I hurt you, but I didn't mean to. I was overwhelmed, with work, with family, with everything. I thought putting you here would make things easier. For both of us. Easier?" I repeated softly. "For who, Daniel? For you?" He flinched at the sharpness of my tone. "You called me a burden," I continued, my voice steady. "Do you know what that word did to me? After everything I gave up, everything I sacrificed, to hear that from my own son." I shook my head, blinking back the tears that threatened to fall. It broke something in me. "Mom, I raised my hand, silencing him. "No, you will listen." I opened the wooden box and slid the notebook toward him. "Read." He hesitated, then began flipping through the pages. His eyes scanned the words. The nights I went without food so he could eat. The mornings I worked with blistered hands so he could wear new shoes. The winters I stayed awake to keep him warm. Every sacrifice laid bare in ink. I watched his face change, shock, discomfort, then shame. His jaw tightened, his breathing grew uneven. "Mom, I didn't know," he whispered. "You didn't want to know," I corrected. "You were too busy building your life on the foundation I bled for. And when that foundation grew old and tired, you cast it aside." He looked up at me, eyes wet. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought you'd be better cared for here. This place gives me food and medicine, Daniel. But it doesn't give me love. That was supposed to come from you." Silence filled the room. His gaze dropped to the floor, shoulders slumped. For the first time in his life, he looked small to me. Not the powerful man in suits, not the child I once carried, but a man stripped of excuses. I leaned forward, my voice softer now but no less firm. You want to know what a burden is? A burden is raising a child alone, working yourself to the bone, giving everything you have, and then being told you are nothing but dead weight. A burden is love repaid with abandonment. His lips trembled. Mom, I'm sorry. I don't want your apology, I said sharply. I want you to carry the weight of what you've done. I want you to remember every word in that notebook, every tear I shed, every sleepless night I endured. That is the burden I give you now. He covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking. For a moment, I almost reached out, almost pulled him into my arms like I used to when nightmares woke him as a boy. But I held myself back. This was not my burden anymore. It was his. After a long silence, he looked up at me. His eyes were red, his voice raw. Is there any way I can make this right? I studied him, the man who had once been my little boy. Perhaps there was hope for him yet. Perhaps. But hope was not forgiveness, and forgiveness was not forgetting. You can start, I said, my voice steady, by remembering that love is never a burden, and by ensuring you never treat anyone else the way you treated me. Not your wife, not your children, not me. He nodded slowly, as though the words were sinking into his bones. When he left that evening, he carried the notebook with him. I allowed it. Let him read my life, page by page, until the weight pressed so heavily on him he could not ignore it. As the door closed behind him, I leaned back in my chair, exhausted but relieved. For the first time in years I felt heard. Not forgiven, not repaired, but heard. And that perhaps was enough.